computer. All right, and I'm going to share. All right, share. And then there's the PowerPoint. So, and I always bring this slide. If you've ever been in any of my CE classes, you see me show this. We don't rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. I just love that thought. And so anyway, so basic rules of the class. We don't make derogatory comments about companies, business models, agents, whatever, right? Just your standard common courtesy behavior. Introduction. So let's go around. I should have had that. Let me stop my share real quick. Let's just go ahead and introduce ourselves. So the slide will say, how long have you, your name, how long you've been in real estate, and then who you're with, and then do you know your list to buyer ratio? So we'll start with Amy, ladies first.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm Amy Atkinson. This is my 20th year in real estate. I'm Realty HQ, listing to buyer ratio. I don't know.
If you don't know it, just say I don't know.
Don't know.
Okay. Brian?
Brian Hayes with Fathom Realty, also 20 years this year, and my second career. And my buyer ratio, I've always been more heavy on the buyer side than the listing side. I like being a buyer's agent.
Okay, that's perfect. And we're going to talk about both listing and buyer services, right? Today's client services, that's kind of the topic. And so I'm just going to keep my slides for talking points rather than, just run the whole screen where let's just make this like a casual conversation. How's that? So I've written down some things. Sellers, you got communication, you have reporting, right? You have feedback, staging, photos. So tell me, what do you think, would make good client services for a seller? And I want to put an emphasis on, if you do it right, getting price reductions are really easy if you do it right. So think about that. So what do you think a list of services would be? I mentioned communication reporting.
Right. I was going to say communication is the number one on listings because your clients feel if they don't know what's going on, nothing's going on.
Right. Right. That's a great point. I'm going to actually write that down. If they don't know what's going on, if they do not know what is going on, then in their mind, nothing's going on, right?
Right. They assume nothing's going on.
Because they don't know, you're not telling them what's going on behind the scenes.
Right. They assume nothing. That's a great line.
Right.
And so it's true. And so, when I was an agent on the streets, I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Rob Aubrey. I am a mortgage lender. I've been in the industry for 33 years. So between, I've been a real estate agent, associate broker, principal broker. I ran a team, I've done loans. I'm a licensed CE instructor. So, I've been around the industry. And so when I was running a team, we had systems to communicate. And so one of the things we would tell the seller or ask the seller on the listing appointment, hey, we can communicate with you phone call or email. Now it's text, but I recommend email. It's easier to tag and bag and keep track of it. Because that way if you say, hey, I didn't hear from you, you say, well, no, here it is. Here's the email sent on this date, And you can put more email. You can put attachments better and all that, blah, blah, blah. And so we would tell them, we're going to send you an email once a week. And that email would show them statistics of marketing statistics. In other words, we get data from the MLS and all the different tools that the MLS provides, right? Like of tracking how many views and whatnot. And we would put all that in a report for them, and it would show them the the stats of their, their activity on their listing online, the number of showings, and then any feedback we can get our hands on. And we would send that out to them every week. And we would always have in the email, it says, the three things that we can control is the exposure, right? In other words, getting it out there and letting buyers see it. So the second thing we can control is the condition of the home. And the third thing is the price. So we would always start off with exposure, and that entailed the web activity, the number of showings and whatnot, and feedback. That was exposure. And then so if the three things are exposure, condition, and price, we'd say, look, obviously we're getting a lot of exposure and your home is in great condition. So the only topic is price. And by having that kind of narrated in an email weekly, after 3 or 4 weeks, the seller's like, all right, what should we do about that price? And I would just respond with, what do you have in mind? And if they came up with a number, let's say we're at 550, and they're saying, well, we should go to 5.25. I agree, and I'd send the paperwork over right there on the spot and get it signed. And so, but having that system of communicating them with the important information. And then of course, you always want to follow up with them, when showings happen, that you want to go right back to them and just let them know, hey, here's what happened, whatever.
Right.
So it would be a good idea hearing what you're saying to use part of your statistics to show them also the homes in their area that have reduced their listing price. I'm seeing that right now. I'm seeing that more than I have in quite a while.
Yeah, it's actually.
But I'm
not
also, I'm also
ahead.
still seeing agents overpricing their homes, thinking that we're in the market from 2 years ago. So that's, I think, why we are seeing more
price
reductions of pricing is because they're overpricing and not letting the seller dictate our position and not in our pricing.
Right. Yeah, you have to be really strong with the sellers because, like you said, the market did this and flattened out, but the sellers kept going.
Right.
So that's, you really have to get in there and show them, and you got to stay on them like day one. If it's overpriced, and have that conversation, be like, Brian, Amy, your home is nice. I think your price is aggressive. And so, and the key is you have to be able to show them that by overpricing, it actually could cost them more money.
If like I had one that they wanted to overprice it and I made them sign 2 price adjustments for 7 days out of each one at the listing.
Right.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Absolutely. Right.
And I just said at this date, if there's no offers and we are lowering to this price, and then by this date, we are lowering to this price.
Right. Excuse me. Yeah, get it signed right at the listing appointment.
Because I'm like, I will give you this amount of time at your price, but you need to be to my price to where I can actually sell it by this date.
And you have to keep in mind their motivation, right? See, the key is, obviously the better the price we get at the listing appointment, the faster it's going to sell. And so I always say, look, a seller only has 2 questions, right? Think about it. And the 2 major questions and all the other questions are variations of the 2. And the number 1 question they have is, how much money am I getting? Right? And so variations of that, what do you charge? Can't we list higher? Those are all just variations of how much am I getting? And the second question they have in mind is, can you get it? Right? And variations of that are, I've never heard of your company. What do you do to sell homes? And blah, 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 blah. They come up with all these little different things, but they really all boil down to, how much do I get and can you get it? And so the key that I always done with listing presentations was, because their number 1 question is, how much am I getting? So, and it's very, very important to, on your pre-qualify the listing appointment phone call, is what price they have in mind. And if they tell you they don't have a price in mind, they're lying.
Right.
The extreme example is, some guy calls you up. He says, "Hey, I got your name. I have a friend that lives in Utah, or blah, blah, blah. I met a guy here. He lived back there, blah. Gave me your name." He says, "I inherited a property. I have a long lost aunt that died. She owns a home in like some town called Thule, and they don't know how to pronounce it. They're from out of state." And so, and he's never seen the home. So, yeah, that guy doesn't know. But if they've lived in the home or they live here and they've owned it for 10 years, whatever, they have a price in mind. They do. I don't care what they tell you. They have a price in mind.
But not only
So,
with that price in mind, they've probably talked to 4 different realtors and they're not getting that price that they want.
right. Well, that's why you want to flush it out on the phone. So now you know that when you go to the appointment, right, that you have the ability, or not the ability, you know what your strategy needs to be. You know where you need to spend your focus, right? And so what I would do is I would bring the comparable data, right? And it wasn't even always just comparable data. I would bring all the homes in the area that sold and are active and under contract in their area. And even if they weren't a comparable sale, I would still bring it anyway, because the idea was, because if you're going through the comparables and they say, "Hey, what about that one around the corner?" and you don't have it, they now lost confidence in your information. So I would bring them and say, "Yeah, that's one of these over here," and I show them these ones here don't really compare. So let's put them aside. And then let's focus on these. And these are like bigger, that new subdivision. They don't really compare. Put that over there. And so then I would focus on it, and I would make them, rather than bring a CMA and say, "Here's your price," I would bring the sold data and then I'd go through it with them. I would ask them, "See, look at this one. How many square feet? Just like yours, right? How many bedrooms? 4. Yeah, just like yours." I would literally make them do a CMA. The more motivated they are, right, the closer they'll get to the real price.
Right.
And when you ask them, after you've seen all this data, what price do you feel we should be at to get a buyer to buy your home versus all the other homes? And they're like, the longer, the bigger the gap between what they had in mind and reality, the longer the silence. And we tend to talk our way out of it, or, whatever. Just keep your mouth shut, ask them the question and button up.
Yeah.
And they'll come up with a pretty good price if you do it correctly. So that's kind of how I like to handle that. And then do like Amy said, have, if they're too aggressive, have 2 price adjustments ready to go and have them sign it.
When they ask the
You know?
question, where should I list at, or what do you think the agent, think my home is worth? I tell them, well, let's go through a few things and then I will let you tell me what you
Right.
think when we're done.
Yeah, let's
And
just go through
and I always have an average for them. I never give
Yeah.
a price. I always have an average with, with a $50,000 window.
Right.
Also, I'm noticing, especially in my area up here in South Davis County, there's a sweet spot for homes right now. And it's about 550.
Right.
And
That's even Salt Lake County.
Okay. Because I set myself up on daily reports for all the listings in Salt Lake County too, so I could keep up on what's going on. And that seems to be the sweet spot. And it seems to be that everyone is listing right around there within a few $1,000s. So I would also, I think, in a kind way, say, here's your competition, and there's this many homes listed in that price range, and they're selling this fast, and they've had, just what we were saying, they've had this many price reductions. That would also help them drive where they think the price should be, because, and you need to tell them too, being smart about your market is very important, because you need to be able to say, yes, but that home has this feature and that feature that your home doesn't have, or you do have this feature and that feature that they don't have, to justify the price.
That's exactly.
Hey, well, welcome to the meeting, Richard. If you could jump on camera, that'd be great. I know you were in a car, but that's okay. It's always nice to see a face for rather than a black space in a name, you know?
Mhm.
How do you handle, this is a very serious question I have. I guess I've always been a better buyer's agent. First of all, that's how I started in the industry, and I got really well trained on how to do that. And I just like the going shopping process. It's fun. I know it's a lot of work, but I enjoy it. And I've always noticed in my mind, and maybe it's because I set myself up for this, that sellers tend to be high maintenance. They're always anxious about what's going on with the listing, even though you do the communication. It's almost like they want daily reports or something on the showings. And I even though you tell them I'll send you a report once a week, or if you have a major question in between, you feel free to call me. But I always find that they are very anxious and very, are we getting feedback? What are they saying about the house? And I always try and tell them, if they're not giving feedback, and I go through the process, I said, look, I ask for feedback personally, and then the system I list with constantly sends out this many reminders, this many texts, this many emails. And if they're not answering us, it's kind of like the title of the movie, they're just not that into you. There
Right.
was there was just something about your house that didn't fit them, whether it was the price or whether it was, and I will
Whatever.
give you the feedback I have, but they always tend to be so anxious and wanting to know what they think. Did they like it? And I'm like, don't do that. I can't do that with you.
But I
Right.
also have to explain to my when I'm listing that right now there's a huge controversy on feedback.
Right.
Mm,
So I explained to them that if they you don't get an offer, that's our feedback.
yeah,
Right.
Because at this point, if someone doesn't like your home and the agent tells you they don't like their home and then they come back and write an offer, well, your seller now has a sour note on them because they already
Right.
said they didn't like and what they didn't like. And I know that
And there's been lawsuits over that.
that's what I was going to say. There's lawsuits because of it. And a lot of brokerages are telling their agents
Not to get involved in
not to
it.
give feedback.
so explain that to me. I'm out of the loop on the lawsuit thing.
So, so there was a case where they, the buyers and the agent were kind of like dissing the property, if you will,
Oh,
on audio and video.
got
They
it.
didn't make an offer, but then they came back later on and made an offer, and the seller was upset with them and just said no, and everything they asked for, no, 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 no. And so, and somehow the agent, no, the agent gave the information or whatever, and then came back. So obviously they liked it more than they let on to be. And
Mhm.
so when it came time to negotiate, the seller wouldn't negotiate a thing. And it got known to the buyer, and the buyer turned around and sued their agent for giving that information.
Right.
Oh,
Because the
Because
agent
it,
gave up too much
right,
information
it
it
weakened
and
their
weakens
said
their
position.
position.
yeah, it
Okay.
said exactly what their clients said about this house. They were in the lawsuit, the agents or the buyers sued the agent saying they devalued their fiduciary duty.
Right.
Right. Okay, got it.
So, I mean, it's huge. And I know there's another one that I heard about today that's in Utah that's kind of getting a lot of it's getting a lot of motivation behind it
Momentum,
because
momentum.
yeah, momentum,
Movement. Yeah.
you know,
Okay. Well, that's good to know.
because that was going to be my question is what your thoughts were on feedback. I have a listing right now and every time they leave the house, they're like, what did they think? To where I have to remind the seller.
I know.
I can't ask, I will ask that, but because of the way the market is changing, they do not have to give us feedback at this time. If we get an offer, that is the feedback that we have received.
Okay.
Yep.
Good to
And
know.
it,
I did not
and
know
a
that.
lot of that is setting up the expectations multiple times. Because when you're in a listing appointment, you go through all the comparable data, and then they don't remember much after that.
Right.
So you have to constantly remind them, on a routine basis. So I recommend you send an email like, Monday or maybe Tuesday, and then have a phone call on Thursday to where you're really hitting them up. And you're just saying the same information from the email to
Mhm.
the phone call.
And mine's like every other day on my listings
Right.
because it's like, okay, this is what's happened the last 2 days. This is how many showings we have scheduled. This is what we have coming up. This is what I need to get ready for the open house,
Right.
As long as they know something's going on,
Right.
it's the
They can
lack of
go
communication.
they can go a day, but
Yeah,
3 days they can't go.
no. And the lack of communication, I lost a listing because of the lack of communication because they expected a phone call every day and I was only given it every other day. And then they wanted me to be at the house right after the showing.
And do
And
what?
I couldn't do it.
Right.
What, to secure the house or something?
Not
Oh,
only that, but they wanted me to meet the agent there and find out what their feedback was.
oh, that's no.
Yeah, so it was one I gladly gave the listing back.
Yeah.
They had overpriced the listing
Right. Then they
and
weren't motivated.
yeah, and they went up, it was a crazy one. And I've watched it and 6 months later it's still steady and active
Right.
Interesting.
with the price reduction of over $75,000. So,
Wow. Okie dokie. So I don't feel so bad then.
no.
Well, the key is though, the key is to really set up but find out from them. How often do you expect me to contact you?
Mhm.
Yeah,
And if it's
that's
every
a good
day,
point.
so I would call them every other day and text them every other day. So that way they're being contacted daily.
And if their expectations are so not reasonable
Unrealistic.
for you, then you need to
Don't take the listing.
don't take the
Right.
listing. Yeah.
Well, and
Mhm.
not only it's overpriced and they're hot and they're very demanding.
Mhm.
Yeah. I've given more listings back than the average agent's taken.
No, I'm
When I was an
learning
agent on the
that.
streets. Right.
Yeah.
It's not worth it.
I'm
No,
learning
it
that I
isn't.
can say no.
Right. Well, it's just
Yeah.
bad energy. When you have that
Mhm.
energy in you, and then you start talking to good clients and you bring a bad energy to the equation.
Yep.
All right, so let's get it. So that's the pricing. So we know pricing is like critical, right?
Yeah.
And we talked about reporting, we talked about feedback. Let's talk about like photos. Do you guys all hire professional photographers? What
Yes.
about
100%.
you? What about you, Richard? Are you going to join us or just be a fly on the wall? Right. So, yeah, I mean, definitely hire professional photographers. If it's vacant, I recommend staging.
Depends on the
Especially
house.
do virtual staging.
Yeah.
Nah,
I'm
virtual
not a fan of
staging,
virtual.
no. It
Yeah.
looks cheesy online, but
Mhm.
it doesn't matter because they get excited about how nice it looks. Then they go in there, it's vacant.
Right.
Yeah.
They need to,
I have
yeah,
one, the clients didn't want to pay for staging and I just decided it's not always a part of my marketing, especially if they want a discount, then they don't get the staging on my
right,
dime. And they didn't want to do it. So it is going to be a rougher listing because the pictures don't look that great without the house staged.
right.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't feel good when you're in it.
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
Good staging. I mean, there's stats out there. I don't have any in front of me, but there's statistics that show quality photos and quality staging actually increases the amount of money seller nets and a faster sale.
Right.
And quality photos, let's say, even if worst case scenario, it helps you generate more leads.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
So what,
it's a good reminder. I remind my sellers and I put it in a way that okay, what I tell them is I work with a lot of buyers, always have for 20 years. I know the inside mind of buyers. Um, I know when I walk in a house, I can see the potential in a house. I can see how to stage it. I can see what needs to be done. I can see that. That's one of my gifts, is just I have the vision.
Mm-hmm.
Most buyers, 99% of buyers, do not have that vision. They
no,
can't
that's why
they,
staging's important.
exactly. And that's why I say, and they can't get past Deep Purple in the girl's bedroom.
I know.
I tell
It's
Right.
them
okay in a
it's
bedroom.
Yeah, they just can't for some reason. So we have to help them as much as we possibly can by giving them a vision of what your house could be.
That's
Oh, but
exactly
they picked out the color. They think it's wonderful. And
Oh, I
so,
know.
and one of the things when you're on the phone before the appointment, you have to ask that question. So I'll ask, so, I'll say, hey, Brian, so tell me about like the decor of your home. Would you say it's neutral or would there be some personal flares?
Got it.
You know what I mean? In other words, you got purple rugs and orange walls. That's what I want to know.
hmm
Okay.
So when you show up for the appointment, you should know so much about the house. Tell me about the
Right.
kitchen. Oh, we updated it. Did you replace the cabinets? No. Did you paint them? Yes. Did you hire a painter or did you do them yourself? Well, we did them ourselves. What about the countertops? Well, we replaced them. What did you replace them with? With tile. Okay, great. So it means it's got 1,000 grout lines to hold fungus. And so, you know what I mean? So the idea is you got to know when you're there. All right,
Yeah.
so welcome Carla's iPhone 16. So part of the things we did early in the meeting is we introduced ourselves. And so you told us who you were, how long you've been in real estate, who you're with, and do you know your listing to buyer ratio? So we'll start with Carla and Richard. Guess not. So anyway, all right. So so we covered staging, we covered photos. Photos and staging, in my opinion, come along the same way. And so the other thing is you really have to hammer these people hard on depersonalizing and decluttering.
hmm
Yeah.
When they gotta, because especially people that lived in their home 30 years, it's become a monument to their life, right? And the new buyers are trying to visualize themselves living there. So it's hard to see yourself living in someone else's monument to their life. And their kids are ugly. I mean, oh man, there's all kinds of stuff that goes along with that. So, any other thoughts on that? Any other thoughts about seller services? So, I don't really know that there is. I mean, we talked about communication, reporting, and that's part of communication. You're reporting to them weekly or periodically. And then feedback, talked about sellers that, agents have been sued for providing feedback. And so that a lot of agents aren't going to do it. And then staging and photos, we need to make sure, we have professional photography and staging if need be. I mean, if they got a nice home, great. All right, let's go
One of
through
one of
buyer
my
community. Go ahead.
I
Sorry,
was going to
Brian.
say, one of my, not to diss any in particular agent, but one of my pet peeves is the photography of these listings.
Oh,
When you can
yeah,
tell they're standing there with their phone and shooting themselves in the mirror, etc. And
right.
all I can think is,
They're
you are
poor
making
sellers.
thousand for some, you're making thousands,
We assume they're
we
making
assuming.
1,000.
But even so, I have a
That
photographer that'll shoot a whole house for
Yeah, for 100 and something bucks.
100, yeah, $100, $150, at least a few pictures, right? It's just not that expensive. And the other one is when
No,
they use the AI to put the descriptions of the rooms. Oh my gosh, it's
go
like,
back and edit those.
yeah, please don't use those.
Like I saw one, it's told us every room had baseboard. It's like, whatever.
Besides, that's your opportunity to sell the house, it's you put some oomph into your descriptions, or don't put them at all. Actually, it's kind of
Right.
Right. So, all right, so let's talk about buyer services, right? You're servicing a buyer. So I would say communication is just the same, you know, but obviously your buyers are different because you can be talking to them 3, 4 times a week, going out and looking at houses. So, if nothing new came on the market, they know, and so there might not be a lot of communication, but it's different. So you have to have a lot of counseling with buyers, especially first-time buyers, right? Counseling. I mean, we have to counsel them on, the mortgage process, the credit process, especially if they come from the scratch and dent shelf, we got to maybe fix them up a little bit. But reporting would be giving them, obviously listing alerts. And so, I highly recommend that you have your own website with IDX and that you hook them up with listing alerts there rather than the MLS.
MLS. Okay.
I'm
Why?
never,
Why do you prefer that, Rob?
because one, they can comment about them, they can rate them. I can tell what they're looking at.
Oh,
The other one is, why would I send them to a website where they can find other agents?
Right.
oh, yeah. Okay, yes.
Duh.
Can I ask a question? One of the
Sure.
comments I with sellers is um, why aren't they making offers? If they think it's overpriced, why aren't they making us offer
Oh,
that where it's
yeah,
supposed to
I
be?
got something for, well,
Yeah.
one, so I would say, look, there's 3 rounds of elimination. Number one, if you have a lot of stats on the computer saying your property was viewed thousands of times, but no showings, that means you're being eliminated at the computer.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the buyers do not think you have enough value. You're not offering them enough value for them to get in their car and come over here and look at the home. If you have a lot of stats and then you have quite a bit of showings, but no offers, then they're still saying the same thing, but you're closer. And then,
It's usually a price concept. It's usually price at that point. If you can get them
right.
there, but then there's something just quirky, it's usually overpriced.
And the other thing you got to remember is the seller, when we do comparable sales, we may be a mile, 3/4 of a mile, but the buyer, we're kind of stuck in that 1 mile box for comparables for the appraisal price. However, the buyer's not stuck in there. They can go to Provo to Ogden.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So, it just depends. So there's a lot
That's a good
in there.
point. I guess you could mention too that the pool of buyers that want to live in that exact same neighborhood are rare compared to the general population, like you say, that has a, they can look anywhere. And if you are one of those, it's always price. It's always
Right.
price.
Right. But the way I present it is based on they're not seeing the value based on the price you're asking.
Right. Okay.
Rather than just say price. They don't see the
Okay.
value based on the price you're offering. But like you can go 5 miles and there may be homes that are bigger and cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And so like I said, we got reporting is similar. Like how many agents? So Brian, you said you're heavy on the buyer side. If you're having a hard time finding a home for a buyer, do you check the for sale by owner list and see if there's anything in there that could work for them?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I also will, and I've done it in the past, I don't do it all the time, but if they have like if I've been at showings and they say, "Oh, too bad that house isn't for sale. It looks like a nice house." And I've gone to the door and said, "Hey," not right then, after I was out here with some buyers, they were looking at properties, they look at your house, et cetera, et cetera. They really like it. If you ever consider a listing, would you give me a call? Because they'd be very interested. And if they're interested, others would be too.
Right.
Something like that. And I actually got a listing. It's not like I said, it doesn't happen all the time, but I did get a call back. Do you remember when you came to our door? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah. I said, well, we're ready now. And it was
Right.
6 months later, but they were ready.
Right. So a lot of times, yeah, because the key is finding out their motivation.
Yeah.
If they're saying, hey, we're building a house, it's not going to be ready for 8 months, well, they're not going to be that motivated today
Mm,
because if they sell it, they got to move,
yep.
So, but 6 months later, 7 months later, they're starting to get extremely motivated.
Hmm.
So I have on my client service buyers checklist, I have communication, reporting, FISBO list, and counseling, right? And then, we kind of talked about that. So counseling's a big one. You have to have, so do you guys do I call it a buyer listing presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever done that? And so,
Every buyer.
right. So the way I did mine was, I would set up an appointment and I would just say, hey, let's get together. I call it buyer orientation. It's a no obligation meeting. Let's sit down. We'll chat. We'll share each other's expectations. and what we expect of each other, what our wants and needs are. And then if we're a good fit, we'll move forward. If not, we'll shake hands and go our separate ways. No big deal. It's like you got to take the pressure off of them to get that meeting, right? Now, sellers are different. Sellers are like, I'm going to ask them, when I see you, are you prepared to sign a listing contract? I mean, it's a big difference, because I'm not going to go there and educate the seller and then so their nephew can get it for a discount. No, I'm not going to do that. But anyway, so the way I do it with the buyers is I talk briefly about financing. Here's how financing works. I give a brief overview. You don't want to get in the weeds of financing. Let me, as your lender, do that. And then I go into the home buying process. I'm going to set you up on my website. You could see all the listings. I have all the listings that Zillow has, realtor.com. It's all the same. We have it, but this is a private. So when you click on things, nobody knows that information but me. See, if you start clicking on things at Zillow, they know that, and they're going to sell you. They're going to sell you to anybody. But as your agent, I'm not going to give any information away. It's between you and I. So that's why we're going to click on there. And then what I want you to do is I want you to start looking at homes, and then eventually we'll set up an appointment. We'll go out on a Saturday morning. We'll look at maybe 5 or 6 homes. And I said, then when we narrow it down to 1 or 2 you like, we'll just go back and look at those 2. Then when it's time to make an offer, let me show you the paperwork we use to make an offer. And then I pull out a REPSI, and I go through the REPSI with them. I pay special attention to section 3, 8, and I believe it's 21, right? 3 is important that they know that they're not going to show up at 4:30 at the title company on a Friday afternoon and expect the keys,
Right.
You got to explain that possession thing and funding and recording. And then 8, you got to explain, here's where, we do a home inspection. If you don't like it, we'll cancel the contract, give you earnest money back. If it doesn't appraise, we'll cancel the contract, give you earnest money back. If you're not happy with the terms of the loan, we'll cancel the contract, give you earnest money back. So, and, and then, I want to make sure I pay attention, go through that. I go through the other clauses too, but then, then I pull out the buyer due diligence checklist. And then I pull out the FOIA protection, get an inspection. I pull out the wire fraud disclosure. And then I'll even show them a copy of a blank copy to seller disclosure. It's like 16 pages now. And they you got this stack of papers on your desk. This is, what's going to happen in an offer. And then see now, the reason why I do that is twofold. One is you don't want to explain a REPSI when they just found a house they like and buyer's remorse is setting in. You want to explain to REPSI when there's no pressure to make an offer right now. So that way, when it is time to make an offer, it's a lot faster to blow through the REPSI. Then that's one thing it does. But also what you've just done is you've just established why they need an agent. You got a 6-page REPSI. No, and that's not counting addenda. You got 16-page seller disclosures. There's 22. You got 2 or 3 with the buyer due diligence checklist. You got the wire fraud. You got the FOIA protection. Then I look them in the eye and I go, Brian or Amy, I'm like, Amy, do you want me to handle the sale for you? And they're like, well, yeah, now they do, because now they know why. Most people don't know why they need an agent. They're like, can't I just go click, click, and the thing shows up at my door tomorrow morning? That's the culture that we live in. People don't understand. They don't do any due diligence when they buy. They click online and it shows up at their door. And so,
Rob, don't you have the list? I think you said at one point you had it prepared. I used to call it the 188 things that can go wrong during a transaction. I think you expanded it.
Yeah, we have one. I have one on one of my sites at like the 184 things an agent does for their client, stuff like that.
Yeah, I remind them of that.
But, see, I go through the legal part of it, and I scare the crap out of them is what I do.
Yeah.
That's the objective. You see their eyes starting to widen. Look at all this legality. See, they don't realize all the legality that are involved. Now they understand why they should sign a contract. Do you want me to be your agent? Right. Well, the state of Utah requires, in order for me to represent you, we have to have an agreement, a written agreement.
Remember the transaction we just did, and my transaction coordinator accidentally sent my buyer broker agreement to the listing agent for some reason. I don't know. I think it just got one of those, you clicked the wrong thing. And
Right.
so fortunately, I had a great relationship with this listing agent. I mean, we became fast friends really quickly, and she's awesome. And the whole transaction was actually wonderful. But she said, she called me to say, hey, you may not know this, but Amy accidentally sent me your buyer broker agreement. I said, why? You don't need that. She said, that's what I said. I don't need this. She said, but I kind of snooped. And I said, what do you mean? She goes, well, I read what you charge. And I said, okay. She said,
And we don't talk about specific commissions.
right. So she said, how do you get away with asking for that commission? And I said, what? What do you mean? She goes, what do you do to justify asking for that commission? And I said, I don't justify it. I show them what I do, and they've
Right.
never questioned it. So once I show my clients what I'm willing to do for them and how I negotiate for them and how I handle the transaction, et cetera, I've never had anybody question it. I said, and
Right.
besides, that also leaves me room to negotiate on my side. If I need to, I can reduce it. And so she said, "Oh, okay." She goes, "Because I always, when I think a seller's getting more than I am in a transaction, I always want to know what the seller's doing to justify asking for more." And I said, again, they don't have to justify it if they do a good job.
Well, yeah. Well, you see it on Facebook all the time. The question is, why is the listing agent taking more than what they're paying? It's like, well, you mentioned it earlier, Brian, you don't like to be a listing agent. You prefer buyers. Being a listing agent is harder.
Yeah,
It just is. Because if it wasn't harder, everybody would have more listings.
Hmm.
it takes a certain temperament to do
Correct.
it. It really does. To do
You
it
need to be
well.
able to handle sellers' confrontations on a daily basis
Yeah,
and not take it personal.
right.
In all honesty, I don't know how people can take, you know, 7 to 10 listings at a time. My max is 4,
Right. But
just
the
for the
thing is,
communication alone.
you can handle 10 sellers with the same energy as 4 buyers.
Right.
But it's all about
Yeah.
systems, Amy. In other
Yeah.
words, you don't have the right systems in place. And if you have 10 listings, you typically have staff.
And I like to do everything myself. I don't have the staff. I don't have the TC. I'm
Right.
still just do it for me. And
Right.
Yeah.
then I don't, I've
See,
never wanted to be a top producer. I've always just wanted to do my business.
my mantra is no job is too small to subcontract. So there's a thing
I
called the
like that.
cash
Yeah.
flow quadrant, right? Robert Kiyosaki, he was the guy that wrote Rich Dad Poor Dad.
Yep.
So the sequel to that was called cash flow quadrant.
Yeah.
So the cash flow quadrant, upper left was E, bottom left was S, upper right was B, and then I, bottom right. And one was employee, self-employed business owner, investor. So a characteristic trait of an employee is I want a steady paycheck.
Hmm.
Then a characteristic trait of self-employed was I can't find anybody to do it right. I'll do it myself, you know, i.e. Amy,
Hmm.
right? I'll just do it myself. And then a business owner says, well, why do that when you can find somebody else to do it? Right. And so that's
Right.
the biggest shift. So the shift from employee to self-employed is not that big. The shift from self-employed to business owner is huge. And then an investor wants to know when they're going to get their money back. So typically investors invest money into businesses, business owners hire S's, and S's hire E's. That's the cash flow quadrant.
Amy, I
Okay.
was
That makes
always like
sense.
you. I always wanted to do everything myself because I didn't trust somebody else to do it, and I knew I could do it better. Uh,
Hmm.
this is the first time well, not the first time. I had brokerages where a TC came as part of the
The
package.
program. Yeah.
Yeah. And I enjoyed that. But since I've gone to the independent with what they call no fee brokerage, right? Um, I hadn't done that. But very long story, I won't bore you with the details. I went through a horrible bout of COVID, wound up being diagnosed with fibromyalgia and long-term COVID, and there's all this stuff going on with my health. And I had already decided as I'm jumping back into the market, and by the way, this is all very great information because I really am restarting my business after being sick for very long. But I finally actually hired a transaction coordinator um, because I just don't have the same capacity right now.
Right.
I forget things. I have very hard time with my energy. Still am battling with that. And so I just decided I can't do this by myself. It was already overwhelming me. Um, so I hired a transaction coordinator and I told my wife what I did, and she said, "Oh, thank goodness. I wish you'd
Right.
said that a long time ago." Because I would stay up all night, transaction coordinating, filling out paperwork and loading up
Hmm.
the paperwork and blah, 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 blah. And hiring Amy is the best thing I've ever done
By the
because I
way, it's not
explained
Amy Atkinson he's talking about.
no,
Yeah.
no. It's Amy from Fathom. She's an agent, but
Right,
she also does. But I explained to her my current deficits, my brain fog, and all the things that are going on. I said, I'm only telling you this so that when I forget this or I forget that or I don't, I said, I need you to do that for me. I need you to remind me to have this done and Fathom has a certain set of documents that are above and beyond the regular MLS stuff, some
the
forms we
legal
have
stuff,
to fill
right?
out, kind of
Hmm.
CYA documents, right?
Hmm.
They're good CYA documents, but I always forget them and I always forget that I need to do them. And it would always hold up my transaction and I would always not get paid on time because I didn't do these things.
Right,
And then I was embarrassed because I had to go back to the client and say, I forgot to give you this form, blah, blah. But this is when we closed, I was paid. Done. I got paid
right.
because Amy had done everything.
It was all
And
Hmm.
done.
I said, that's the best investment I've ever made to not have that stress. And if I get listings, I will do the same thing. And I will also pay her extra to do the things that I do not want to do or don't
Right.
like doing. I will
So
do it.
when I coach an agent, one of the first things I make them do is get a transaction coordinator. And here's what I always hear. Hey, when I get busier, I will hire one. I'm like, no, hire one and you will get busier because you're going to spend more time getting deals than servicing deals,
Yes.
right? If you're
Yes.
servicing deals, you have less time to find more business. It's
Yep.
cheaper to hire a transaction coordinator than it is to do the work yourself. People think, well, I could save money. I'm a DIY. Utah's a very DIY
Yeah.
culture. It's like, no, no, you
Yes.
lose money.
Hmm.
You lose money. There are people out there that are way better than all of us on this at doing that kind of work. Now, can I do it? Yeah, I'm intelligent. I'm motivated. Do I like doing it? No, I can't stand it. I'd rather be a cold calling than doing paperwork.
And and that's when I talked with Amy to hire her. Um, she said, I love paperwork. I love doing it. I love the challenge.
Yeah,
I said,
Hmm.
I
the
don't.
checklist and all that. Yeah,
I don't.
exactly.
I
See, that's
don't.
what I'm
I don't
saying.
like
See, and I like
She
the
likes it.
paperwork.
Right. See, I like the sales portion of it.
Hmm.
yes, but instead of spending my nights during this last transaction doing paperwork, I was on the phone with other buyers who I'm now going out.
Right.
Right.
Which will net you
Right.
more money? The
Yes.
X amount of dollars you saved because you did it yourself, or adding two more transactions to your pipeline.
Right.
Hello.
Right. No,
You
it
know,
makes
one's
sense.
one's $500, the other's 20 grand. I don't know about
Right.
you. You know, I'm not a rocket scientist, but I know 20 grand is better than 1,000.
Hmm.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. So, all right. So based on this call, so we talked about having systems, you know, buyer presentation is, listing presentation is very important. But like we talked a lot, we spent a lot of time on the listing systems and whatnot. So here's the question. Based on all the discussions we had, what system do you plan to put in place for listings?
I don't know how to get listings. The only listings I've ever
Well, we
gotten,
didn't talk about lead generation. This is
okay,
just client services day.
on the back end. Oh, well, I'm going to hire somebody to help me do a lot of that stuff. That- I am. I just,
Well, it doesn't matter that somebody else does it. If nobody's doing it now, you don't have a system.
oh, got it.
Or you have a
See what
system,
you're
it's just not
saying.
a very good one.
It took me a minute to get back to home base. Sorry, but yeah, I get it. Um, no, I personally need to have a list like this of the things we're talking about doing.
Right.
Make sure I do those things and don't forget to do those things and do them all the time consistently.
hmm I mean, I have a pretty good structure of my system, but I just need to put it in a formal written something that I always
In a
know. A
checklist.
formal, yeah.
See, listings are checklist
hmm
and buyers, contracts are, um, what's the word, more calendar based. Like listings services are checklist, contract services are calendar driven.
hmm
They're
So,
tasks, but they're calendar driven.
right.
Do you have a skeleton like that that we can work off of, Rob?
I don't, I used to, I looked at my system and somehow it's not there anymore. I'm
Okay,
sure I have something somewhere. We don't delete anything. We just buy 20 terabyte hard drives now. But now the problem is to go find it.
right.
hmm
You know. So I was gonna ask Amy if she would mind if she was going to put something together, would she share that with us? And then
Yeah,
I'll share it with everybody that registered. We had 10
yeah.
people registered, so 4 show up.
And I'll go back to Fathom. I know they must have.
I'll bet Amy or TC does.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
yeah. And I have one. I just need to look at it.
Yeah. Look at it. Doesn't have to be pretty. We'll just put
Yeah.
it in a spreadsheet and share the Google sheet, and that's it.
Okay. Okay. I can send that.
I will make that my homework to come back with that.
Okay.
Then and I recorded this, so I'll be able to send it out. People can go listen to it. So any other thoughts, questions, concerns, hallucinations?
Um,
The idea is the mastermind. So the more people we can get on here collaborating, I think the smarter we all become.
Right.
So I would encourage you to invite somebody.
Okay.
I would throw in when we're assessing our clients' needs, the seller needs, are they going to be buying another home? Or are they moving out of state? What's going on? Because either way, I want to make sure I'm their buyer's agent,
Right.
which is amazing to me as I've taken on buyers and I talk to, I vet them and they tell me, oh, well, we're selling our home right now and we're waiting for it to go under contract. I said, what? Then why are you calling me? I said, isn't your agent? No, no, they never talked to us about that. I said, they didn't.
Well, that's not
What?
good.
Why? Why are they not? Okay, I'll take you on. I'm happy to do so. But in my mind, I'm thinking, what agent of any, if you, okay, let's say you don't like being a buyer's agent, you just don't ever want to work with buyers, then you should be referring within your own sphere of influence your clients out to another buyer's agent. Why am I getting the phone call from
Right.
clients
hmm
that they need a buyer's agent?
Right.
Right.
So yes, we all need to be aware of that. And if they're going out of state, I refer them
Yeah,
through whatever
absolutely.
hmm
system you have. We have a system. Um, so I would refer them and get a referral fee and I follow up through that transaction in the other state with that agent. I stay on top of it, not as much as if they were my buyer, but yes, I make the phone calls and I find out what's going on. And clients have then referred me other people just because of the way I helped them through the flow. And they felt like I was holding their hand even when they were out of state.
Right.
Right.
So that's very important. Clients are clients for life.
Right. Okay, guys,
If you
I'm
treat them
sorry.
right.
I've got to
Yeah,
jump
I got
into
to go
another
too.
appointment.
So
Hey,
this will be so noon the second Wednesday of the month. So
Okay.
it'll be on the 14th. Then I'll send you out like an email a week in advance,
hey,
and then like I do, text and bugging you. Let's get your butts in here.
hey.
Okay.
So
Sounds good.
thanks, guys.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.